The God of the Bible is famous for his mercy. He forgave murderers. He forgave thieves. He forgave the very men who nailed Jesus to the cross. But there was one specific nation he refused to ever forgive. The Amalekites were so unspeakably wicked, cowardly attacking the sick, the elderly, and the defenseless in the desert, that God issued a decree unlike anything else in Scripture. He commanded their absolute, total erasure from human history. No mercy, no prisoners, no exceptions. Why did the God of love issue a 1,000-year death sentence against one specific nation? Today, you are going to find out. And what you discover will not stay in the ancient world. Because the same spirit that made God refuse to forgive the Amalekites is still operating today. This is the real story of the most terrifying nation in the entire Bible. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what made the Amalekites so uniquely evil that God refused to forgive them, and why their spirit is still the most dangerous enemy you face today. To understand what Amalek was, you have to understand the world immediately after the Exodus. Egypt was not a minor regional power. Egypt was the undisputed superpower of the known world, the most sophisticated military, the most advanced economy, the most fortified cities. And the God of a nation of slaves had just publicly, catastrophically humiliated them. 10 plagues that dismantled Egyptian theology, one deity at a time. The Red Sea splitting and then closing over the most elite chariot force in the ancient world. The greatest army on earth swallowed by water in a single afternoon. The shock wave from that event traveled across the entire ancient Near East. The Bible records it precisely. The Canaanites heard, and their hearts melted. The Moabites were paralyzed with terror. The peoples of Philistia trembled. Every nation that received the report of what happened at the Red Sea understood one thing with absolute clarity. There was a God moving through that desert with those people, and that God was not to be tested. Every nation understood that. Every nation was afraid. Amalek marched straight into the desert to pick a fight. They did not challenge the warriors at the front of the Israelite column. They did not send a formal declaration of war. They circled behind the column like predators separating the weakest from the herd. They found the stragglers, the sick, the elderly, the pregnant women dragging children through the sand at the rear of a column 2 million people long. People who had nothing left, no strength, no weapons, no capacity to defend themselves. Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 17 and 18 records it with devastating plainness. They attacked the rear, all who were faint and weary, and they did not fear God. That last phrase is the key. They did not fear God. Every other nation on earth had looked at the evidence from Egypt and arrived at a rational, self-preserving conclusion. This God is real, and he is dangerous. Amalek looked at the same evidence and made a different calculation entirely. They were not confused about God's power. They were not ignorant of what happened at the Red Sea. They knew, and they attacked anyway. This was not a military engagement. This was predatory terrorism committed against the defenseless in direct defiance of a God they knew existed. That distinction matters. Amalek was not a nation that had not heard. Amalek was a nation that had heard, understood, and chose opposition anyway. Now there is a detail buried in the text that most people miss entirely. The Amalekite attack happens in Exodus chapter 17, verse 8. But look at what happens in verse 7, the verse immediately before the attack. The Israelites are camped at Rephidim, and they are quarreling with Moses. They are questioning whether God is actually present with them. They ask the question that would become the most dangerous question in their history. Is the Lord among us or not? The attack comes in the very next verse. In ancient Hebrew, the numerical system known as gematria assigns numerical values to letters and therefore to words. The numerical value of the Hebrew word Amalek is 240. The numerical value of the Hebrew word safek, which means doubt, is also 240. They are numerically identical. This is not coincidence in the Hebrew interpretive tradition. It is a coded theological signature embedded in the text itself. The Amalekite spirit does not attack when you are strong. It does not attack when your faith is clear and your confidence in God is settled. It launches its ambush at the precise moment you begin to ask whether God is actually with you. The attack at Rephidim was not random. It was timed. Israel expressed doubt, and Amalek appeared. The two things share the same numerical identity because they are spiritually the same thing. Doubt opens the gate. Amalek walks through it. God's response to the attack is recorded in Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. He does not simply command a counterattack. He makes a declaration. He tells Moses to write it down as a memorial, to rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, that he will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And then, in verse 16, he makes the oath. He swears by his own throne. He will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. This was not a military policy. This was a cosmic verdict delivered from the throne of the universe. Amalek had looked at the living God, understood exactly who he was, and chosen to attack the weakest of his people to prove he could not protect them. The sentence for that was erasure. Total, permanent, generational erasure. The question was whether Israel would carry it out. 400 years passed. The wilderness generation died. Joshua fought and partially subdued Amalek, but did not finish the command. The judges came and went. And then Israel demanded a king, and God gave them Saul of Benjamin, a man head and shoulders above every other man in Israel, anointed with oil and filled with the Spirit, the first king of the covenant nation. And God came to Saul with the bill that had been accumulating for 4 centuries. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. The word of the Lord through the prophet Samuel is unambiguous. Go now and strike Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them. Kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. This was not a complex command requiring interpretation. This was the 400-year-old verdict of Exodus 17, being handed to the man with the authority and the army to finally execute it. Saul mobilized 210,000 soldiers. He marched against Amalek. He fought, and he won. The Amalekite army was crushed. By any conventional military measurement, the campaign was a success. And then Saul compromised. He spared the Amalekite king, Agag. He spared the best of the livestock. The things that were good and valuable he refused to destroy. Only what was worthless and despised did he actually devote to destruction. As the text records with devastating irony, he kept the best. He killed the rest. He executed the letter of God's command where it cost him nothing and ignored it exactly where it would have cost him something. But the detail that exposes the true nature of Saul's failure is not the sparing of Agag. It is what he did immediately afterward. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 12. Before the prophet Samuel can even reach him to deliver God's response, Saul has already moved on. He has gone to Carmel, and there he has set up a monument in his own honor. Read that carefully. Saul wins a battle in direct obedience to a divine command, partially executes that command, spares a demonic king he was told to destroy, and then, while Agag's blood is still fresh on the sand, sneaks off to erect a statue to himself. This was not confusion. This was not a battlefield judgment call made under pressure. This was a man who understood exactly what God wanted, decided that his own reputation mattered more, used the victory to build his personal brand, and kept the enemy king alive as a human trophy to display to an admiring audience. He traded the approval of God for the applause of men. When Samuel arrives, and Saul greets him with the words, "I have performed the commandment of the Lord," Samuel's response is one of the most devastating lines in the entire Old Testament. "Then, what is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of oxen that I hear?" The evidence of Saul's disobedience was audible before he finished his sentence. You cannot argue with livestock. Samuel delivers the verdict that will define the rest of Saul's life. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. The kingdom is torn from Saul's hands in this moment, not eventually, not conditionally, permanently. A decision made on a battlefield in a moment of ego-driven compromise forfeited the throne of Israel forever. But there is still Agag. Saul spared him. Saul could not bring himself to execute the divine verdict on a captured king because kings do not kill other kings in front of crowds if they want to be celebrated. Samuel has no such hesitation. He calls for Agag to be brought before him. And the text records, without drama, without elaboration, without any of the emotional apparatus Saul required to make his decisions, that Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Not executed, not put to death, hacked to pieces. Samuel understood what Saul refused to understand. You cannot negotiate with a cancer. You do not spare a root because the root looks manageable. You do not keep a demonic king alive because killing him in public feels uncomfortable. The command was total destruction for a reason. Partial obedience is not a lesser form of faithfulness. It is a different thing entirely. Agag was dead. The threat appeared to be over, but Saul had waited too long. Between the victory and the execution, between the moment God commanded total destruction and the moment Samuel finally carried it out, something had been quietly, invisibly set in motion. A seed had been planted in the dark that would not show its face for another 5 centuries. Fast forward to the end of Saul's story. The man who was anointed king of Israel is standing on Mount Gilboa, surrounded by Philistine armies. The battle has turned against him completely. His sons are dead. His army is broken. He is wounded by archers, bleeding out on a hillside, watching everything he built collapse in a single afternoon. He asks his armor-bearer to run him through so the Philistines cannot capture him and make sport of his dying. The armor-bearer refuses, so Saul falls on his own sword. And the first king of Israel dies alone on a mountain, stripped of his army, stripped of his sons, stripped of the prophetic voice that had guided him, stripped of the spirit that had anointed him, stripped of everything that had once made him the most powerful man in the nation. A battlefield scavenger finds him. The man sees that Saul is not quite dead and deals the final blow. He strips the armor from the body. He takes the royal crown off the head of the dead king of Israel. And when he brings the crown to David, and David asks him where he is from, the man answers with 3 words that should stop every reader cold. I am an Amalekite. The exact enemy Saul refused to destroy came back to stand over his bleeding body and stripped the crown from his head. The specific sin he chose to protect, rather than eliminate, returned to finish what Saul started on Mount Gilboa. He did not die at the hands of a Philistine. He did not die by the sword of a rival Israelite. The final blow on the life of Saul of Benjamin was delivered by the people he had been specifically commanded to erase from human history, the people he had chosen to spare, because their king made a useful trophy. The terrifying poetry of God's justice does not require commentary. It simply requires observation. Saul refused to kill the Amalekites to protect his ego. The Amalekite spirit he kept as a trophy came back and stole his crown. The exact sin he refused to destroy became the exact instrument of his destruction. Not as a metaphor, not as a theological principle illustrated by a story. Literally. A man who identified himself as an Amalekite stood over the bleeding body of Israel's first king and stripped his crown while he was still dying. The lesson does not need to be explained. It needs to be felt. Do you see the terrifying poetry of God's justice? The thing you refuse to kill will not stay where you left it. It will not remain contained to the space you assigned it. It will grow in the dark, and it will come back for what you value most. Saul kept Agag, and years later, Agag's people were standing over Saul's body. The sin you spare today will not thank you for your mercy. It will use your mercy against you. After the death of Saul, the world moved on. David became king. Solomon built the temple. The kingdom split. The northern tribes fell to Assyria. Jerusalem stood. Jerusalem fell. The Babylonian Empire rose, and the people of God were dragged into exile in chains. Babylon fell to Persia. The Persians became the dominant power of the known world. Generations were born in captivity and died in captivity, and were replaced by generations who had never seen the land their ancestors wept over. And through all of it, the Amalekites faded from the historical record. No more desert raids, no more rear attacks on stragglers. The name appeared less and less. The story of Saul and Agag faded into a dusty historical footnote in a nation that had larger catastrophes to process. The world forgot about Amalek. But sin does not die of old age. It does not fade because nobody is paying attention to it. It does not dissolve into irrelevance just because the generation that created it is gone. The seed that Saul's disobedience planted when he chose a trophy over obedience, when he kept the root alive because destroying it was inconvenient, that seed was still in the ground, silent, dark, patient. The root of Agag was festering in the shadows. 5 centuries passed. 5 centuries of empires rising and collapsing, of prophets warning and being ignored, of exiles and returns and partial rebuildings and compromised covenants. 5 centuries of the slow, grinding machinery of ancient history, turning while nobody watched the specific thing that Saul had refused to finish. And then the silence broke. It did not break quietly. It did not announce itself with a skirmish on a distant border or a minor political incident that could be managed. When the dormant curse woke up after 5 centuries, it did not come for a tribe or a village or a military outpost. It came for every single Jewish man, woman, and child on the face of the earth, simultaneously, with a legal decree backed by the full administrative and military authority of the greatest empire in the known world. The Persian Empire at its height controlled approximately 40% of the global population. Every road, every tax collector, every soldier, every governor in 40% of the human world answered to one throne. And someone had just convinced that throne to sign a death warrant with every Jewish name on it. 5 centuries of silence had not killed the Amalekite spirit. 5 centuries had given it time to climb, to find the right corridors of power, to position itself at the right table in the right palace, at the right moment in history, to wait until it could strike not with desert raids against stragglers, but with an empire behind it and a royal seal on the paperwork. Saul thought he was dealing with a military enemy. He thought the worst-case outcome of his disobedience was a captured king and some livestock that should have been destroyed. He had no framework for understanding that the seed he refused to pull up in a desert camp in 1000 BC would spend 500 years growing roots deep enough to wrap around the throat of an entire civilization. The seed of Agag was awake, and when it opened its eyes in the courts of Persia, it was looking at a target that Saul never imagined his disobedience could threaten. It was looking at the bloodline that would produce the Messiah. For centuries, nobody wrote down what happened to the descendants of Agag after Samuel hacked him to pieces at Gilgal. The record goes quiet. No census, no genealogy, no historical footnote tracking the survival of his line through the upheavals of the following 500 years. It existed as a gap in the record, the kind of gap that history produces when a story appears to be over. But God does not lose track of bloodlines. And the book of Esther opens in the court of the Persian king Ahasuerus, and into that court walks a man who will become the most dangerous human being in the ancient world. His name is Haman. He is the most powerful official in the Persian Empire, second only to the king himself. He has the ear of the most powerful monarch on earth. He has the resources, the authority, and the ambition to translate personal grievance into imperial policy. And he has a specific, consuming, irrational hatred for a specific Jewish man named Mordecai, who will not bow to him when he passes. The hatred is disproportionate from the beginning. Mordecai's refusal to bow is a personal insult, but Haman's response is not personal. Esther, chapter 3, verse 6, records that it seemed contemptible to Haman to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He wanted more. He decided to destroy all the Jews, all the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, from one man's refusal to bow to a royal decree for the simultaneous global genocide of an entire people. The escalation is not rational, it is not proportionate. It is something older and deeper than political calculation. Now read Esther, chapter 3, verse 1. Who was Haman? Haman the Agagite. Agagite, a direct descendant of King Agag, the very king that Saul kept as a pet 500 years earlier. The root that Saul refused to pull up in 1000 BC had spent 5 centuries growing in the dark and had produced a man standing at the right hand of the Persian throne with a pen in his hand and a genocide decree in front of him. The decree goes out through every province of the Persian Empire. Esther chapter 3, verse 13. On a specific date, every Jewish man, woman, and child in every territory under Persian control is to be killed. Not displaced, not enslaved, killed. And their possessions are to be plundered by whoever carries out the execution. The edict is sealed with the king's ring. Under Persian law, a royal decree sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. It is permanent, it is legal, and it has the machinery of the most powerful empire on earth behind it. Now follow the chain. If Haman's decree succeeds, the Jewish population of the Persian Empire is eradicated. The tribe of Judah is among them. If the tribe of Judah is eradicated, the bloodline of King David is cut off. If the bloodline of King David is cut off, the genealogical line that Matthew chapter 1 traces from Abraham through David, through the Babylonian exile directly to Joseph, the husband of Mary, is severed. And if that line is severed, Jesus Christ is never born. God was not being cruel in 1 Samuel 15. God, looking across the entire arc of history from a vantage point that sees 500 years as clearly as 5 minutes, was issuing a preemptive verdict on a bloodline that would one day stand in a Persian palace with a pen in its hand and a decree designed to erase the Messiah from human history. His command to destroy Amalek completely was not his harshest moment. It was his most merciful act toward humanity. The severity toward one nation was grace toward every nation that would ever need a savior. And then look at who God used to stop Haman. Esther chapter 2, verse 5. Mordecai the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, from the family of Kish, the exact same tribal family as Saul the son of Kish. God looked at Saul's catastrophic failure and raised up a man from the same bloodline, from the same family, to stand in the gap that Saul's disobedience had opened. Same family, same enemy. 500 years later, different outcome. Mordecai did not spare Haman. Esther did not negotiate with the decree. The Agagite line was cut off in the courts of Persia by a Benjamite from the family of Kish, and a Jewish woman who was willing to risk her life to finish what Israel's first king refused to complete. God's correction of Saul's failure was surgical, generational, and complete. But the ancient bloodline made one final attempt. Fast forward to Bethlehem. Jesus is born. And within months, a king issues an order for the mass slaughter of every male child in Bethlehem under the age of 2. His name is Herod. He is an Idumean, an Edomite, and Amalek descended from Esau's grandson, while Edom descended from Esau himself. Different branches, same root. The ancient enmity against the seed of the covenant people marched all the way from a desert ambush in Exodus 17 to a manger in Bethlehem, wearing a different name but carrying the same spiritual signature. The blood feud that began when Amalek attacked the stragglers in the desert followed the messianic bloodline across 1,000 years and tried one final time to cut it off at the source. It failed. The Lion of the tribe of Judah rose from the dead, and the ancient blood feud ended with its defeat, written permanently into human history. Now look at your own life. You do not fight physical Amalekites, but the Amalekite spirit is not a historical relic. It is the pattern of the undealt with thing, the compromise you made and called mercy, the sin you are keeping alive because destroying it publicly feels uncomfortable, and keeping it privately feels manageable. The Agag you have chained in a back room of your life because he makes a useful trophy, and you are not ready to pay the social cost of actually finishing the job God gave you. Saul did not think he was making a catastrophic decision. He thought he was being reasonable. He thought he was exercising nuanced judgment in a complex situation. He thought the gap between what God commanded and what he actually did was small enough not to matter. He kept one king. He spared some livestock. He built a monument to make himself feel like the gap did not exist. And 500 years later, Agag's descendant was standing in a Persian palace with a pen in his hand and the name of every Jewish person alive written on a death warrant. The sin you refuse to kill today will become the exact sin that hunts down your children tomorrow. Saul thought he was being merciful to Agag. He was not being merciful. He was being unfaithful. And his unfaithfulness to a command that felt excessive nearly cost the entire human race its savior. You cannot negotiate with a cancer. You cannot put an Amalekite spirit on a leash and expect it to stay leashed. What you compromise with today will not remain the size it is today. It will grow in the dark. It will climb toward power. And it will come back for what you value most, with more authority than it had when you first decided to spare it. What is your Agag? But you do not face this alone. The Amalekite spirit feeds on doubt. It attacks at the rear, targeting the exhausted and the faint, and the ones asking whether God is actually present. That is its strategy. It has not changed in 3,000 years because it does not need to. It works. But the finished work of Jesus Christ is not a defensive posture. It is not a shield that holds as long as your faith holds. It is a completed victory over every spiritual force that has ever moved against the covenant people of God. On the cross, the Lion of the tribe of Judah did not negotiate with the enemy. He did not spare what should have been destroyed. He did not build monuments to his own mercy while leaving the root intact. He crushed it. Finally, completely, generationally. Through his blood, you have been given the authority to deal with the Amalekite strongholds in your own life the way Samuel dealt with Agag. Not with negotiation, not with managed compromise, with complete, decisive, costly obedience. The same God who raised up Mordecai from the family of Kish to finish what Saul refused to do is watching your story. The same God who threaded the survival of the Messianic bloodline through 1,000 years of ambushes and decrees and swords knows exactly what your disobedience has left alive and exactly what your obedience could still accomplish. Go into the comments right now and type "No compromise." Let the enemy know that the Amalek in your life ends today. If this video showed you how perfectly God's word connects across 1,000 years,